is CJ Peterson, and welcome to The Journey is Real, where we talk to real people with real passions who share a real portion of their hearts. Today, my guest is James Roberts, and we titled his podcast Sink or Swim. Welcome, James.
Thank you again, JC, and thanks for the introduction, and thank you again for having me on your show.
Welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about why we titled it Sink or Swim?
I think if I'm honest with your audience, you had posed, obviously the guest being myself, the question to come up with my own title, which doesn't rarely happen with the guests having to do some of the legwork. So I appreciate you making me do that, and it's something I've taken on board with regard to my own show, The Mindset Athlete, as well. Okay, you want to come on my show, you do some of the legwork instead of me trying to come up with a title or listening instinctively with something that's quite catchy that you've said in the episode, and it's you actually promoting it from the very start. So, and to give some context to the listeners as well, as like why I came up with the title Sink or Swim, it comes back to the mindset of how I've been brought up. It's kind of a quite positive way of looking at things. Ultimately, you either sink, you hit the canvas, if I use the boxing analogy, or you rise to the surface and you learn how to, in a sense, swim as a child, and you kind of navigate your way through life.
Now, I am aware of part of your backstory, but my listeners are not. Would you mind sharing a little bit of that to kind of catch them up to where we are?
Well, I'm from a military background. My father was in the US Air Force for, I think, roughly over 20 years, and my mother worked for NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, for just over 30 years. So as a military brat like yourself, I spent 19 years of my life on a military installation. So my upbringing is probably slightly different even to where I live now in North Wales, that it gives me, if we delve a little bit deeper, I did a post, I think last year or 2 years ago, I can't find it, where I was trying to find my identity, because ultimately I don't feel that I fit in here, or I didn't, more specifically. And I also didn't feel like I fitted in with where I grew up in Belgium, because ultimately the people, well, very specifically, that people are there 3 to 5 years maximum, they move on. So the people that I grew up with don't live in Belgium anymore. They're spread out all around the world. So I think it gives me a different perspective on the world, because I was very much at the epicenter of Europe. I could travel to the Netherlands, to France, to Germany, at a push, Spain, Italy, and I did a lot of traveling when I was growing up, and I think it kind of made me who I am now.
Being in that mindset, I did grow up Army brat, so I kind of get that. You also have the benefit of NATO in there as well, but it gives you a full mindset, a full world mindset, I should say. So cultures, history, people at their core, and you get to meet people at their core, where race, color, skin, whatever, doesn't matter. It's who are you at your core. And that's how I am as well, is I look at your core and say, okay, are you a good person or are you a bad person? What are you like at your core? What makes you you? And when you grow up in that type of a mindset, it's hard to figure out where exactly you fit in. Thankfully, I found my home in Texas. When I came here, Texans are friendly, they're feisty, they're welcoming. They'll give you the shirt off your back, and the sunsets are like no other. So I have found my home, but I also learned, like you, that home is, what you make it, where you are. Home is where your heart is. When they say that, they really mean it. So whether you're traveling a lot or whether you're at home, wherever you are is your home, as long as, your heart is there.
I think, and that's why I probably had to reflect a lot back then, and did a bit of soul searching, so to speak. Visited a lot of the areas that we've got of outstanding beauty. And kind of, I think I'd gone up to Scotland for a weekend away with my basketball team that I played for.
Mhm.
And it took probably taking pictures, writing some content to realize, well, I don't have to go all the way up to Scotland, which is about 2 hours plus drive. I
Ah,
can go
my
now.
heart's breaking.
I can
To be
go with,
that close is like,
well, the UK is not that big
mhm,
in perspective when you look at it. But obviously, I've got the luxury of the mountains, the sea in both directions. It's probably no more than an hour drive inland, and I'll be in Snowdonia, which is our second largest mountain in the UK.
wow,
Well, the park is Snowdonia. Sorry, Snowdon is the mountain, um, and ultimately, I'm about half an hour walk from the sea. It's
wow.
it's not that far. So I guess I get the best of both worlds.
Mhm.
Obviously, at the time we were recording, it's tourism season, so it's not the most ideal. It's not the most ideal time of the year, and then you bring in COVID in with that. It
Mhm.
makes things a little bit more challenging. Um, and
Do you ever just go to just get away? I mean, with COVID, you kind of are in lockdown, but you're kind of not because you can go walk up in the mountains and not have
mm,
anybody anywhere near you.
no, because of I think this is the problem with social media. It's made it's simplistic for anybody to find, those quiet spots that once upon a time probably were.
Hmm.
Anybody
They're
can,
not
and
anymore.
we went to Snowdonia weeks ago. Not like I think about maybe a couple of days after we'd come out of lockdown. Never
Hmm.
seen so many people. And then I think the following week, and they've still got this signage when you come into Wales. Obviously, do the park and ride because people were parking either side of the road on the side of the mountains. So there's that many people getting away from the cities coming into
Oh,
the countryside that ultimately the infrastructure itself can't cope. So we are chomping at the bit to when the tourists. I'm not too fussed about saying this, but to when the tourism industry obviously dies down a little bit. Obviously, going to be a little bit later this year than normal. But then actually the locals can actually enjoy
mhm,
what's on their doorstep, which we didn't really have taken advantage of because it went from kind of you can't leave your locality. Some people were abusing that, and I'm not disputing that because we could only at one time travel no more than 5 miles away from our house, and that went from 5 miles to nothing. So it would have been nice to that they probably extended that radius a little bit first, and then obviously you could go a little bit further than the next town.
yeah,
And my next town along is not that. I wouldn't want to go there most of the time anyway. But I digress
I
from
under
that.
yeah, I understand what you're saying. We used to live in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, which is high tourist season. So what would take you normally about 10-15 minutes during tourist season takes you over an hour. You can't touch the beaches with a 10-foot pole because it is inundated with people on their vacations and enjoying it, and you don't have that option of going. And if you were in lockdown prior to tourist season, you know, that not tourist season is your time to enjoy everything before it gets inundated with people. So you guys are probably
Normally,
like,
well, normally I wouldn't be that fussed because ultimately last year I didn't even really notice the summer holidays
mhm,
at all. I'm probably too busy on myself and the business to really notice. But
mhm.
ultimately, either side of that, I noticed it, and you are starting to see the idiocy of people because we were walking along the beach a couple of days ago.
Mhm.
People like this on their phone. I
At,
should have
at
because I'm
mountains
on.
and beaches.
But they're not. Well, it's trying to put it into perspective. We've got a Pontins that is a once upon a time would have been an institution for people to come to the seaside. It needs knocking down now. It's past it's had its heyday, and it's had so much bad press over the last probably 5 years that
Mhm.
you're thinking, well, how's this thing still open? But ultimately people want to get away from the big cities, want to kind of get some sense of reprieve,
Mhm.
which I can't fault them for, because being cooped up in a house for 2-3 months
Mm. Gets
wasn't
a little
ideal for
stale.
me.
Mhm.
It probably wasn't ideal for most people, but I think it probably it's their way of probably having some sort of normality. But I think this is where the politicians don't think of it. Well, what impact is that going to have on the locality, not just where I live, but be it for my business coach who lives on the other side of the country? He lives in a resort town.
Mhm.
What impact does people coming in from the cities have on the actual outbreak of the virus? And I
Yeah.
don't think they think of that, because there's a particular area that's struggling in England in the northwest
Mhm.
that's high risk, but they still can travel here, which
Yeah.
I think is idiocy.
Mhm. Well, that's like here, the big stores, big chain stores can stay open, but the mom and pop shops have to close. Well, they're the ones that are now going out of business because the big stores have sucked up all the money, and the mom and pops are like, well, how do we make our ends meet? We can't even pay our rent. But we digressed. So let's bring it back around. To the reasoning behind the podcast is, like I said, a lot of people don't know your story. You do have a handicap. Would you mind explaining what that is and how that has affected you growing up
Oh,
to where we can reach toward the aim
okay. I think it's not the easiest thing to be able to, for people listening, to visualize this, and let alone for the ones that are watching on YouTube, because you can't see below the table. So I'll do my best to give some context to the disability that I had. I relate it to having an amputation because it's
to?
easy and people know that that's as a mainstream disability now. But what differentiates me from, I'll call them regular amputees. I can't remember what a teammate used to call it. Like call, I think the amputees were mutants, and the one regular folk, I can't remember what he called us. But I digress from that. But my disability is obviously from birth. I've got a small femur. No, sorry, get this right. I've got no femur, so the top half of my leg I don't have. I've got a small tibia and fibula, which would be the bottom portion of my leg, and I don't have a knee joint at all. So it's the bottom portion of my. If, to give some, to visualize it, it would be on a, for people that are watching. Say I've got from my elbow to my fingertips. That would be my foot. So I've got the bottom half of the leg attached to the hip. So if we kind of go right back to the very beginning, CJ, my mother was told by the radiographer, due to the amount of bones I'm actually missing in that foot, I shouldn't be able to walk. But obviously, I was never told that until I asked as a teenager. Well,
Which at that
how
point
much?
you were already.
I've already learned to crawl. I've already learned to walk. As I put it in my website, obviously it took longer, but I got there and I overcame those odds.
Mhm. Well, I know last time we talked, we had a little bit of an internet issue, so this is kind of our second go around at it. You mentioned your grandmother and how inspiring she was in keeping you focused and keeping you going and giving you that last boost. Would you mind sharing that with those who are listening?
I think, well, I think the female role models I've had in my life, my grandmother, as you mentioned, my mother and my aunt, have been probably the role models that I had
Mhm.
growing up. So I had very much a female influence. So I was okay with my emotions growing up, talking about it. Um, the only thing I went away from that was sport, because sport tells you to kind of put the shutters down, and any emotion that you portray could be taken advantage of. And I've done it myself to other individuals. To, if I can get under your skin, I've got you on tenterhooks, and I've beaten you because you want to play my game now. But obviously, digressing and come back to your initial question, I think because of me being different, and we didn't always see eye to eye, especially when I was a teenager, because the comment she said to me, "I don't see you as black," which obviously at that age I had a problem with, because if you can't accept one portion of who I am, as
Mhm.
an identity perspective,
And not the other.
ultimately you don't fully accept me as your grandson. So that was, I think my mom let me fight that battle myself. It's like, well, um, she could dish it out, but
Mhm.
couldn't take it. Whereas I think I've learned from a mother, if you're going to dish it out, you're going to have to take it.
Mhm.
So I'm very one for, if I ask for criticism, I damn well need to take it because I've asked for it. If I don't want the feedback, I probably need to hear it anyway, a little bit sometimes,
Mhm.
because that's how sport was. It's gonna tell you black and white. If you're doing something wrong, you need to know that to make it to totally fix the issue. And I think ultimately the mindset of the sink or swim, it probably comes back from her generation of living through World War II, having parents that fought, being in the First World War. I think the only downside of, I think, their resiliency and in the whole, and being like reflective of where mental health is now, is they probably internalized a lot of things and look to get on with it. And I think that's trickled down a little bit from family member to family member, and I can see where sometimes the issue of insecurity and not necessarily vulnerability, but a little bit of pessimism can creep in within the family. I think it comes probably back from obviously some things that they didn't do, they didn't deem that important. I won't say that important, but circumstantial. It's, we must get back to some sort of normality and rebuild our lives.
Well,
But
in
that's a
understanding,
traumatic experience.
right, and understanding that there's a portion of them that is closed off, and you have to understand the why. And they were taught, to shut it off. So your grandparents or your parents, depending upon what generation you're in, part of them were closed off to you, and because of that, and you don't know what's going to trigger them either. Something simple may trigger them, like a sound or a smell, and you don't know why because they won't tell you. You know
Well,
what I
that's why you gotta try and keep. Obviously, she's no longer with us, but she's not been with us since, when did Grandma die? 2002.
mean?
But she's probably the, I don't give her as much credit as she probably deserves, because I give a lot of credit to probably coaches, ultimately myself, because I had to do the work. But if it wasn't her kind of being that forceful presence, I would say,
Kind of
with my
driving
mom,
force pushing you.
you must you must do this for James to give him a helping hand up. And my mom took it upon herself to, as I put in the website, that she went out of her way to probably do something that's very embarrassing. It was very embarrassing at the time, but it's not so much now, to shout over a barrier at the 2002 Commonwealth Games in Manchester to get somebody in the powers of authority within Welsh swimming at the time, and then go from there. But obviously, he uses that. Well, until he died, he used that in after dinner speeches. That actual story of my
Oh
mum
wow.
going out of her way to ultimately kind of spearhead me starting my journey on to where I eventually went to. But I think what's comment was left for me with having a discussion with him back then was, you started too late. I started at 11 for swimming, which it is, in no certain terms, it is for most people too late. But I took that personally. It's like, okay, I'm going to prove you that I don't have to be 6, 7 years old to make it to the next level. And then I think within probably 12 to 18 months, I was in our development program within British Swimming. So,
Mhm.
and I kind of went from there. Obviously, I had my own setbacks throughout my career. That's why I'm trying to, when I'm redoing this website copy,
Mhm.
it's trying to give people more of, obviously, like we're trying to do today, the juiciness of the meteoric, ebbs and flows of my life, which is becoming a little bit more challenging than I thought it would be.
Well, bearing your soul is not an easy task. Being transparent is not easy. Being on a podcast is not easy because you have to be somewhat transparent. For those who aren't aware, can you tell people a little bit about your sports achievements? I know you don't like to brag on yourself, but do a little bit of bragging so they know where you're at and what you've done. We've got
Wow.
about 10 minutes left, and I still want to touch that AIM section. So,
Oh, I'm going to do my best here because it's a long list of accolades. That's why I only do that brief one because it's easier. I've represented Great Britain at 4 World Championships, and I'll go into a little bit more detail than I normally do. That would be across. I've done 3 World Championships in rowing, which is almost every year, so they're not as seen as that important because ultimately the saying goes, you're Olympic champion forever. You're a world champion for a kind of a minute. I've done 1 World Championship in volleyball, 1 Europeans in volleyball, an Intercontinental Championship in volleyball, and then 2 Paralympics, one in rowing and then the other one in volleyball. But I started out my career, as I've just mentioned, I started it way back when as an 11-year-old in swimming. And okay, I didn't fully maximize my potential, and I use that word loosely, as my mum likes to bring it up occasionally. If you'd have put in the same amount of effort you'd have done in rowing into swimming, you might have been more successful. I have my doubts about that because ultimately,
well, rowing
uh,
upper body strength and swimming is the whole thing. That might make a little.
rowing itself is a difficult sport because it's more of a, God, how would I would describe it? Because I asked the rower himself to describe it, and he did his best. It's a When I did the discipline, it was over 1,000 meters, so there's more element of
Oh,
it
good
being a
heavens!
power
That
sport.
is the whole body.
It's brutal on the lungs. I could tell people that I don't miss some of those aspects of training. Swimming, I don't miss training whatsoever. And when I do speak to swimmers, they know exactly what I'm talking about. It's very boring. You could be anywhere in the world when you're in a swimming pool. But I think the aspects that I do miss from the elite side is probably the competition. And I do get probably sometimes too hyper competitive
Mhm.
in, be it even with business or be it when I speak to people, I get too passive aggressive or too aggressive, and it's comfort. It's not trying to be confrontational, but
No, but
sometimes I just enjoy
here's kind of a twist.
battling cages.
Yeah, here's kind of a twist on it. With your background growing up, you want to stand out because you've had a hard time blending in. So that might kind of propel you a little bit more forward. But also with your teammates within those teams that you did, because you're talking about team sports. You're not talking about individuals. You're not talking about like skiing or, you know, something specific to just one person. You were in team sports. And that could be because you were looking for that camaraderie that, we didn't have growing up. I didn't have a best friend. I didn't, you move around too much to make super good friends, and they disappear anyway. So maybe that helped kind of find that balance for you, maybe.
I don't think so, not for me. I started swimming being, and I actually, and people can quote me on this.
Mhm.
I said when I was getting into the end of my swimming career, I
Mhm.
would never go into team sports.
Oh, okay.
And here we are now. When did I leave swimming?
Basketball.
2006. So
Mhm.
nearly 15 years on,
Mhm.
I'm still in a team sport. But I think because I've looked at it as I still have to be at the top of my game or
Mhm.
try and beat my opposite number in basketball, I've seen an individual element. So, okay, my basketball coach comes from an individual sport background. So I think when he's probably challenged me and got me to look internally when I've asked the question, well, how do I get better in the off season? This one is, we've had a massive off season of 5 months. So, I've not been too bad in terms of, I've not missed the sport that much, but I did some analysis a couple of weeks ago, and that was quite a different take on doing Zoom in a different way. It's more about obviously me, how do I see the game, etc., versus obviously seeing clients, consultations, podcasts, etc. So it's something different that I haven't had over the last 5 months. But I think when we go back, I think it's got me to reflect. If I do make a major championship in, what would it be, 2022, I think is the next Commonwealth Games. It'll be 10 years since I represented Great Britain in London, and it was 10 years previous to that that got me started in sport itself. So it'd be very ironic that I'd kind of go full circle, and all three games I happen to be in the United Kingdom. So that would be a little bit ironic. I would rather it be somewhere more luxurious. That some of them be it in Australia and things like that. We're very fortunate with them being in the Commonwealth. But if, on the other hand, I don't make it, I at least threw my hat into the ring, and I appreciate obviously that coach to kind of say, well, James, what have you got to lose by at least trying it? I thought they'd probably cut people like dead weight sooner than they have, because we haven't got a lot of players to pull from in Wales, but I thought they might be a bit more ruthless than they have been. But that's obviously coming back to my background in sport that's slightly elevated from the common. It's no disrespect to people that make it to that level, but obviously representing the whole island in this case is a little bit more difficult because of facilities, etc. You normally have to move anyway. You've got to move into England for whatever reason to be able to maximize your potential, or move down south to South Wales.
Okay, really quick, we've got not a lot of time left. I wanted to touch on your AIM method and also on your website, because we've mentioned that a couple times. Can you knock that down about 5 minutes?
Okay, that's not a problem.
Okay.
Obviously, AIM, and this is a new concept I've come up with in kind of over the last probably month or so, to kind of go from, as you'd written down previously, the A.M.P method, which was targeted more specifically towards our fellow peers. The aim was to encapsulate, a target. Everybody has an aim in life, be it mindset, exercise, training, nutrition. They want to get better at something, and obviously it took a little bit of work to be able to get to there, and to give some people insight of what the AIM stands for is adapt, improve, and master. Obviously mastery is very difficult, and I don't think anybody, that's normally that's been my top end program, but it's, everybody wants to aim for the middle of the board. So I work my business in from the outside in. So you'd start within getting to know me, like podcasts, my Facebook page or my Facebook group, and then work your way in as you see fit. And if you want to work with me in particular, obviously that comes with the mastery and learning from, well, the highs and lows that I've faced throughout my life. And
What exactly are they learning to do?
Well, to the essence of my business is to lose 10 plus pounds in 90 days or less. So be it most people 10 pounds, they're going to achieve that with no problem in 90 days. So that would be probably, you could either do it through the adapt part of the program or the improve part of the program, based on what you want to get out of it. Can you do it by yourself, or do you need additional support from obviously what I've learned as an athlete, and then also my educational background as well?
So you're kind of working on both ends. You're working on, yes, their physical and however they want to lose, but you're also working on the mental with the whole AIM mindset. You're kind of helping them to stay focused on their target goal. Is that accurate?
That's an accurate assumption, because ultimately this is where people fall foul when it comes to their behaviors or habits. They're not persistent enough, or consistent, should I say, as well, because you get to a certain point, I hit a roadblock, and we'll start again. You don't have to do that, because ultimately I punch through. I use the terminology like punching through, or using Under Armour's slogan, just go through it.
Mhm.
An athlete will go through a freaking brick wall if you tell them to.
So
But
basically, you're teaching them to move past their own mental
that's
roadblocks.
that's generally what's stopping people. It's a mental roadblock because you failed in the past.
Mhm.
You've tried everything and it's failed. It's not worked out. This is your last solution. It doesn't necessarily have to be with me, and
Mhm.
I'm quite frank with people. It could be with another coach,
Mhm.
but obviously let's now stop this procrastination and actually do some work and put in some work and stop talking it and actually start doing it.
Just jump
And
in with both feet and go for it.
mhm,
You can sink or swim, kind of like we were
mhm.
talking about. For those, you mentioned the website a couple times. For those listening, could you please say your website and then spell it out so they know how to find you?
The website is fitamputee.co.uk. So that's FITAMPT
PUT.
no PUTEE .co.uk. And I didn't think I'd actually fumble through that, and I did.
That's okay. It's FITAMPUTEE.co.uk for those who are listening. James, I want to thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much for sharing your story and just for sharing a part of you and who you are and your background a little bit so people can understand, where you're coming from and, what you have to present to help them to get through to where they want to. And thank you guys for listening to The Journey is Real, where we talk to real people with real passions who share a real portion of their hearts. I'm CJ Peterson of cjpetersonwrites.com. Until next time.